It is more than just a game. It is a game of wins and losses, imperishable hope, and coming home. Baseball. It's the game of our lives. Available wherever video is sold.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Not Content Podcast here as part of the From the Q Podcasting Network. My name is Jerome Cuson. If you are listening to us through Apple or Spotify, please leave that 4 or 5-star review. If you are following us along on YouTube, please subscribe and hit that like button. We have been discussing baseball for much of the year. However, this month we are focusing our attention on Ken Burns' baseball. We last week discussed the first 3 episodes, or the first 3 innings. This week we are going to be discussing innings 4, 5, and 6. But Brian, my God, before we do it, apparently last week when we had 2 people to talk about passing away at the beginning, that wasn't good enough because now we have 3. Brian, unfortunately, over the course of the last couple of days since we recorded our last episode, we have lost 3 very important people to our podcast. The first of which is Chris Christopherson, who played Whistler in Blade, and who is somebody that I know you and I are a big fan of. A lot of people probably know him from his days as a country singer, but for you and I, it's all about Whistler.
It's weird because he's also known for being an incredible singer-songwriter. And it's weird, like a generation looks at him as Whistler, and then the previous generation looks at him as like Barbra Streisand's man in that remake of what was that? The Lady Gaga remake. What's the name of that?
Star is Born.
Yeah, and that was like the 3rd iteration of Star is Born too. So, man, he's had quite the career, and his son's a wrestler. And I mean, what could you say about the guy? He's like a legend, and he stayed in great shape all his life, and he maintained this like incredible, handsome look for his age, I would say. And man, just like the timing of Blade and the comeback of Blade this summer that no one absolutely saw coming, it just makes it like, it's unfortunate because we could have had a Whistler cameo and some of these multiverse Blade stories that they were trying to, or possibly were going to tell in the future. I don't know, but you could have had a cameo from Chris Christopherson in some form or fashion. I think that would have been incredible. It's too late now, unfortunately, but man, he's quite the legend. And look up his songs too. I forget the list of songs he's made in the 60s and 70s, but I think he's got a lot of credits to his name that you'd be surprised about. I got to look it up, but I'm pretty sure like he's one of the unsung heroes of singer-songwriters in the 60s and 70s.
All right, so unfortunately, we also have to talk about the unfortunate passing of John Amos. And this John Amos story is very controversial because there is a very real possibility that he may have passed over a month ago. And there is a huge scandal involving his family that we certainly do not have time to get into, but that is unfortunately the reality of his situation. But you and I really talked about him when we talked about Coming to America, as well as Die Hard 2. Just a legendary performer, a titanic force in the Black community in terms of what he's done in TV and movies. And it's kind of sad that we lost James Earl Jones and John Amos in such a short amount of time, given their legendary scene in Coming to America.
Yeah, man, it's another unfortunate thing too. And I keep thinking like the Good Times thing, and it's a whole different discussion. But did he get screwed over? Right? Did he want to leave? You know what I'm saying? Like the whole idea of his character dying 2 seasons in or whatever it was in Good Times. I'm not a Good Times fan, but when I heard that story, it just seems like so odd that the star of the show would just get killed off like that, right? It's just one of those weird things. I'm going to look into it more, but I always thought that was like one of those screw jobs in Hollywood types of things. But I'll always remember him as Die Hard 2, right? Very untrustworthy in Die Hard 2. A lot of those characters are very untrustworthy in Die Hard 2, but that's like the role that sticks out for me the most. I don't know why. I guess because my grudge with Die Hard 2, but it's filled with good character actors, so I don't know. But the Coming to America has those great scenes with him and James Earl Jones. It's just unfortunate, man. And again, like, I don't know. Did he? I mean, I wish that, like, he would have had some kind of farewell or something like that. But the way this story's coming out, it's just so weird about his death and the details of it all. But it's quite unfortunate. But again, another character actor, legendary character actor. Maybe didn't get the credit that he deserved while he was alive, to be honest, because he's a really great TV actor, and character actor for movies as well. So A lot of credits to his name, and he was on the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I remember him in the Beastmaster when I was a kid, so he's done a lot of these roles all over the place. But yeah, it sucks because I wish he had like a good farewell, but it doesn't look like he had one, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately, he did not get to get John Ashton. Of course, we talked about him last week. He got that nice farewell in a way, and I guess in a way, Chris Christopherson, like Blade, was kind of the farewell. So it's funny just how these things just keep circling back around. And of course, perhaps most relevant is the passing of Pete Rose, one of the more controversial figures in the history of baseball. I think it is only appropriate that we save our Pete Rose conversation when we talk about the ninth inning, because it will become very relevant as that documentary gets into the Pete Rose story. And I think it is, I just think it's best if we save our big picture Pete Rose discussion for then. But here's what I'm going to say. I think that he is not as bad as Ty Cobb, but I think when you look at his body of work, he is in so many ways, not because of the gambling as much, but because of the way that he conducted his personal life. He is almost as big of an embarrassment to baseball as Ty Cobb.
I got mixed feelings. I just, this obsession with gambling and the sponsorships with gambling nowadays, it just seems so cruel to the fact that like the charges that were against Pete Rose were about gambling and stuff, and this idea that I know this sounds crazy, but this idea in America that you bet on yourself, right? That's the idea. You bet on yourself and you invest in yourself. He literally bet on himself, and it's not the American way, I guess. So I know it's kind of crazy to say that he bet on himself, even though he's a manager of the team. He bet on his own team, but in a way that tells you he was confident in his own team. But as a kid growing up, I was never like, I just accepted the fact that he broke the rules, and I just accepted he was never going to be in the Hall of Fame. But now, I would say in the last 2 or 3 years, I've been kind of convinced otherwise, saying that this obsession and the culture of gambling that has kind of taken hold of MLB and these different apps and stuff, DraftKings and all that, it just seems kind of unfair. You know what I'm saying? But I don't know if that's just me and like a changing kind of perspective at all. But it just seems so unfair when I see these videos, these packages that they're putting for Pete Rose, and then they put in the gambling stuff, and then the next commercial is like a gambling app commercial or something like that. So it frustrates me these last couple of years, and I hope that it's not one of those situations where it's like the WWE Hall of Fame where they have to wait till the guy dies and then honor the guy and put him in the Hall of Fame so he doesn't have to give a speech and give a controversial speech, quote unquote. But I think that's one of the other reasons why that they kind of are hesitant to put him back in and accept him back in, because he would have had one of the more controversial speeches in the history of the Hall of Fame if he got back in.
I mean, I think there's a lot to it. I am of the belief that you should put him in the Hall of Fame. But again, like I said last week, I think you put everything that he did on his plaque. I think that is, to me, to me, the Hall of Fame is a museum. I do not think the Hall of Fame should be making moral judgments, but I also think that if Pete Rose, given the not just the gambling, but also the things that he has done to numerous women over the years, that is part of his legacy, and that should hang on him like a scarlet letter, in my view. So I think that might be the best way to handle it. But as I mentioned, we will discuss it more next week, next week. But Brian, here tonight we are going to be discussing episodes 4, 5, and 6. I believe that episode 6, the sixth inning, is the strongest episode. We'll get to it shortly. But you get a lot of Babe Ruth in episode 4. This basically becomes like a Babe Ruth biography. The thing that I appreciate is that we get a real sense of who he is, who he was, and coming up in Baltimore, going to a children's home, basically having no family to speak of, and that being a huge part of his story, but start coming up as a pitcher with the Boston Red Sox. And then, of course, one of the most famous trades in the history of pro sports, which led to the curse of the Bambino, as it has come to be called. Babe Ruth traded to the Yankees, and then his career completely takes off as he transitions from being a pitcher into a full-time hitter and sets numerous home run records for the time, and basically becomes one of the most important baseball players of all time and becomes an icon in the history of sports as well.
Yeah, man, I love Babe Ruth. I'm not a big fan of the Yankees, but I am a huge Babe Ruth fan. Just that aura. I mean, his presence. He's almost like, I compare him to Andre the Giant. He's more like a Hulk Hogan. The Andre stuff is more the mythical stuff in terms of him eating like 6 hot dogs in a single setting, or like drinking a bunch of Coke, and then eating all this junk food and then hitting a home run kind of thing. That kind of leans into more the Andre mythical hero kind of stuff. But he is more like the Hulk Hogan, like Jerome was telling me before we recorded, because he does change the game. They changed the rules of the game for him, because he's just so good. They had to change certain rules and aspects of the game. Um, and I think that sticks out the most in terms of like the all-time greats for me. I think Babe Ruth is the greatest player of all time, only because it's more than what he did for the game. It's what the game had to change around him, and how he changed like the perspective of the game, and how he kind of resurrected, I won't say resurrected, but got the popularity of baseball back after the scandal, which, is so weird considering what happens in 94, and then it takes another, chase at the home run record to get people watching, baseball again. So it's just this weird cycle that happens in baseball where like a scandal happens and something in terms of like a home run hitter brings everyone back. It doesn't really happen nowadays, because like nowadays it's more about extra stats, like with the Ohtani thing. It's like, yeah, he did hit 50 home runs, but the 50 steals to go with it is just as incredible. So there's a little more to it now in terms of like drawing people in, obviously. But Babe Ruth definitely drew people back. And I do want to point out that in the documentary, they do point out that like this whole thing with the Boston Red Sox, this curse that started in 1918, is really just poor management. Like the guy sold 5 of his players, including Ruth, 5 of his best players, to the Yankees. So obviously your team is going to sink down a couple levels after doing that. And the guy did it. The owner of the team did it because he was investing in plays at the time on Broadway as well. So he was selling a player in order to invest in a stage show, and use that money for the stage show. So it's just ridiculous. Like the guy, I forget the owner's name, but he had his priorities not straight, and that's how this whole curse of the Bambino comes about. And in reality, I think he would have done just as big for baseball if he stayed with Boston. But then again, in Boston, they wanted him to pitch more. When he went to the Yankees, they kind of de-emphasized the pitching for him. So that kind of changed, history too as well. But let's not forget that Babe Ruth was also this great pitcher, and he has the stats to prove it for like a 4-season span or whatever it was. It's just incredible. And it is similar to Ohtani. But Babe Ruth has had, I don't know, if you compare the styles of play, Babe Ruth and Ohtani, I think Babe Ruth definitely has that more casual, fan-friendly style that people kind of emulate, and he emulated this swing off of Joe Jackson, right? So, again, going back to Shoeless Joe Jackson, it all kind of comes together, but this is definitely one of the stronger episodes for me just because of this mythical tale of Babe Ruth, and just some of the contract disputes that he was having, too. I thought that was very fascinating for the time, and like how a bad season, he had to go into full Rocky 3 mode and come back and just he took a year off. You see that footage of him in the cold just doing like man work, kind of like what Rocky did in Rocky 4 as well. So I like that little connection there that I put in my head. But yeah, this was a very fun episode. And you can kind of tell that like John Goodman was not the guy to play Babe Ruth. And I hate to say that, but he was just too big to play Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth is 6'2". John Goodman's like 6'6". So, there's that height difference. And I don't know. I just feel like
who else are you going to get to play? That movie has many other problems besides.
Right, but the guy from The Sandlot, I think, felt more like Babe Ruth than John Goodman did. So, it just depends on the character of the facial characteristics as well. But it's really hard to cast the Babe Ruth.
I think the issue is like all biopics, it tries to tell the whole story and doesn't just focus on a certain period of time. Like if you're focusing on Babe Ruth at the end of his career, like perhaps that is more interesting than just trying to do a full biopic. So some other things that are discussed. There is a lot of discussion of Negro leagues, and I think that's really important just to kind of contrast with what is happening in white baseball, understanding that black baseball is so important and so relevant. And part of me really wonders like the impact that this documentary had on Negro League baseball history and just really bringing it to the forefront. Like what impact did this documentary have on that? I would be so curious to know because it is very, very much celebrated. And I think part of it is because baseball has really struggled to maintain consistent players, black players. So I would just be very curious to know. Something else that I really like is that they kind of talk about the end of a lot of careers, and they talk about Walter Johnson in the World Series. They talk about Grover Cleveland Alexander kind of the last old man runs of these two great pitchers. And they also talk about the ending of Ty Cobb's career, which I know you had to not. I mean, I'm sure you were not feeling very sympathetic for what Ty Cobb was going through at the end of his career. And we also get the introduction of radio as well. KDKA in Pittsburgh, most famously. And baseball would, of course, be very much known as a radio sport for a long time, and it even continues to this day with some of the best broadcasters in baseball still doing the radio. So, Brian, any other thoughts on this episode, including some of the last moments of three of the greatest players in the history of baseball?
Clearly a transition was like about to be made, because this is like, you're talking about, like, we're talking about the 20s in this episode. And it's actually crazy that like the Yankees end up with like 4 straight World Series around this time at the end of the decade, and then another 5 straight at the end of the 30s going to the 40s. So if you're a Yankee fan at this time, God bless you, man. You were living in the high times of Yankee World Championships, man, because they had a bunch in a row. And it's not just because of Babe Ruth. I mean, Lou Gehrig is going to be an important figure as well. We're going to talk about more about Lou Gehrig in the upcoming episodes. But this transition from like I would say it's almost like the generation before the WWF boom, and then the Babe Ruth era is like the WWF boom, so to speak. So, I like to make these wrestling comparisons. And then when it comes to the Negro League, we'll talk about this more in the next episode. But it just feels like the Negro League was like a bunch of workhorses in the territory, right? And they were trying to work their way up to the MLB, which is like, McMahon of the WWE, until finally they got in after so many years of being, segregated and, all that racial crap and all that stuff that kept them out of the game. And I like how the historians also talk about how because of this, we're never going to get a clear picture of who the best was around this time. We can get somewhat of an idea and kind of compare stats here and there, but I don't know, someone like a Satchel Paige sounds like he was the greatest pitcher of all time, but we have no record of like the actual stats, and people are claiming he won 2,000 games, which sounds insane. But I don't know. I don't know if it's just one of those things where legends get put out of proportion and out of control, and these legends grow from like, maybe he had like 1,000 games, then they just blew up to 2,000 games, and the next person who told his story. So that's kind of like the fascinating thing with the Negro League in terms of like these stats and the players and the road, like their travel schedules and stuff. It just sounds so like old school wrestling territory kind of stuff. And they were just, as soon as the game's over, they're back on the road and they're like in the middle of the night trying to get a hotel or something, or trying to get food, and they're getting rejected because of their skin color. And they had a hell of a journey, man. And then, yeah, I just think that the Negro Leagues are just so fascinating in terms of that. And the fact that they were drawing like 40,000 people, on the regular, and then they were getting so popular that they were going into like Ebbets Field for like all-star games just for the Negro Leagues. And then it was just crazy how they were just doing so well. And, it's just like the white players or the white owners just wanted nothing to do with that money, which isn't crazy to me, because like you would want more money for your team. And it's just, I don't know, just that racial inequality stuff just really, really sticks out. And it just really just seems like this black eye around this time, because we're never going to really know who is the best. And I'll say that Babe Ruth is like my favorite player of all time, obviously. And that's based on his style and the stories you hear. But was he truly the best? I don't know, because a guy like Josh Gibson also has these amazing stats. So it's just like, it's a very interesting time for baseball. There's always going to be a question mark around this era. But I like how the historians kind of put that in perspective, saying, baseball is this idea of have a level playing field and this representation of America, and they were just leaving out a lot of black players, obviously, that were just as good as the regular white players. So it's just kind of frustrating, but it's also interesting to kind of compare right around the time before Jackie Robinson came in how these stats were being kept, because apparently we lost the number of these stats.
Yeah, and they are counting the Negro League stats, as I believe they should. I think that we need to acknowledge the greatest players in the game. And in this case, I think it is really important to acknowledge the Satchel Pages and the Josh Gibsons and so many others who really were forerunners of this game. And it's really just unfortunate that the Negro Leagues have kind of gone by the wayside, because, I mean, we don't even have TV broadcasts. Like with so much of baseball history, basically since the 50s, we have all this footage of all these games, and we just don't have that with the Negro Leagues. And again, it's really, really unfortunate I also want to point out that the documentary gets into some weird territory when they talk about the House of David. In doing additional research and listening to another podcast, the House of David was very much a cult, and the fact that they had a semi-pro baseball team is very questionable at best.
Yeah, they got weird hair and they didn't shave and they just, I don't know, hippie commune before its time, before they were hip. I don't know.
I mean,
But it was
that's
just
kind
one of
of
those
what it
weird
is.
things. But everyone was playing baseball, so it's just like you got a team, we got a team, we can draw a crowd. Let's split the cost and just put on a game, and that's kind of like what a lot of teams did back then that weren't in the American and National Leagues, right? So you got to keep your skills on top. You know, you got to keep your skills, you know, on point. And this is one of those things where you just got to play these random teams that come along. But yeah, it's hard to explain. They're just like this giant house that had like farm workers that were following their whatever religion or whatever, and then they were growing their hair out like hippies.
So, the next inning, the fifth inning, focuses on baseball in the 1930s, and this is probably the most depressing episode, I have to say, because there's a lot of talk about the very real depression that is happening in the United States, and again, like the nostalgia of the Negro Leagues really comes forth because they talk a lot about Satchel Paige and kind of his facing Josh Gibson is kind of the main event of the episode. But like Babe Ruth, like deteriorating before our very eyes. I mean, that's pretty sad and pretty depressing. And just again, a lot of the talk about what black players had to do in terms of leaving the United States and going to these different countries, the anti-Semitism that Hank Greenberg had to deal with, Lou Gehrig's ALS disease. If a disease is named after you, that is really not that definitely cannot be a good thing.
What I find interesting is that they didn't call it ALS back then, 30 years ago. We just recently have changed it, I think, to my knowledge. Like growing up, I knew it was like Lou Gehrig's disease, but then, you know, as we've gotten older, we realized that just they call it ALS now, and I think that's more the proper term.
I think it's
Because I think obviously people had this disease before Lou Gehrig. We just didn't have the knowledge or the know-how to
correct.
treat individuals like this. And kind of the same thing with didn't Josh Gibson go through what seems to be some kind of mental breakdown into
Yes.
like schizophrenia almost?
I mean, the big thing to me is that when you look at the circumstances that so many black players and even black leaders have had to go through, these kind of psychotic breaks are sadly not uncommon, and I'm sure that alcohol plays a huge role in it as well. It's really really sad, and again, it's what happened to Josh Gibson is criminal, and I think the absolute least that we as a society can do is to say, like, you are considered to be one of the greatest baseball players of all time, and here is that signifier when we redo the home run list, and you are now a part of it, and that to me is the way it should be. And yeah, what Josh Gibson had to go through is it's really really bad.
Yeah, and this idea that this chapter is called Shadow Ball, and it's basically this idea of like a pregame kind of ritual that a lot of the Negro players were doing. It's basically just kind of like, you know, like air guitar except with baseball. You know what I'm saying? Like a fictional ball that's not there, but you're just going through the motions so well that the crowd is imagining there is a ball there from a far away distance, kind of like an optical illusion. I thought that was really interesting because it kind of reminds me of like the Harlem Globetrotters kind of approach to basketball, where it's just like kind of showmanship and kind of thing like that. But then I think the great part of this episode is like the main event that you say, this mythical legend between Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige. And I can't help but think of Major League 2 because that's the exact thing that happened in Major League 2. And I went on this rant like 2 weeks ago that no way a player would ever do that. And apparently Satchel Paige did, man. So the story goes, they were facing off on opposing teams. I think it was an All-Star game maybe or something like that. But Josh Gibson was like 2 batters down. So Satchel Paige walks the first 2 batters on purpose. And I kept thinking, no way this ever happened. And I don't know, the way Buck O'Neil was telling the story, and I guess this is where Buck O'Neil gets to shine because he really tells some good stories in this episode.
This is Buck O'Neil's moment. Like, I mentioned that he was the breakout star. I hope you understand this is like that 3 minutes is why.
Yeah, because this story is incredible the way he tells it. and then he walks the 2 batters, and then he strikes out Josh Gibson. I was just like, dude, this is exactly how it played out in Major League Two, because the story goes that he threw three fastballs towards him, and that was it, all 3 strikes. And that's kind of what happens in Major League Two. So who knows? Maybe I got it wrong and someone was crazy enough to do it. But then again, this is one of those things where it's because of the lack of historical records and stats, did this actually happen? But apparently Buck O'Neil was there, so I guess we gotta kind of take it as fact. But it's such a fascinating story. It's like one of those stories again you hear about like Andre the Giant or something like that, and it's just like no way that happened. But I guess in this case we're gonna have to take it as face value because the lack of records. But it's such a great story. It just makes me think I guess people are that crazy, and I guess his manager just didn't care and just let him do it because I guess it was like an all-star game or something. But I guess there is a record of this happening where someone just walks 2 people just to get to the guy he wants, and it's like a personal vendetta kind of thing going on. But that's such a fascinating story. And like I said, this is the episode that also kind of shows how the Negro League is like workhorses, having a game at 4 p.m., getting on the bus.
In this episode, I think that's really interesting. But there's a lot of myth making in this episode because they also cover Babe Ruth and whether he called his shot at Wrigley or not. So there's a lot of that in this episode. And again, it kind of breaks up. Again, this episode is really sad.
I mean, there are some good positive notes. I mean, they covered the DiMaggio.
I mean, it is, but you're talking about Josh Gibson has a psychotic breakdown. Lou Gehrig literally deteriorates before our eyes. We're talking about anti-Semitism, racism, and I guess there's some of that in all the episodes, and I think there's a melancholy feel to other episodes too, but this one just feels like really underlying a lot of it.
Well, I will say this. Watching the Joe DiMaggio part makes me think that the record can be broken. I just don't know the type of player to do it.
I don't think it will be. I
don't think a power player can do it. It's got to be a guy who's almost like the
you just don't have those guys. You don't have those guys anymore. I think if somebody was going to do it, it was going to be one of these guys like Tony Gwynn or someone of that ilk. Like Ichiro could have done it. I don't know that we have those guys in this league anymore. Like Shohei Ohtani.
It's not now, but I think in the future we'll have someone to do it because it just seems to me that when he was basically what I'm getting from the DiMaggio streak is whenever he hit for power and he wasn't contacting well in the first couple at bats, he was switching it up to just make contact. And I think that's what you got to do in a lot of these games where it's especially what I've heard lately in the last, 2 days of baseball that I've watched in the playoffs. A lot of these big hitters nowadays are just swinging for the fences and not just focusing on contact. And I think that's really key because when I was a kid, I was one of those big players that was just trying to swing for the fences all the time, not realizing it's just making contact can just be just as effective. So I think if you kind of switch that mentality out to some player that will get it and not be a big dude, you know what I'm saying? Maybe
I just think that the way that these players are coached, I think they're taught Walker home run. I mean, that I think is what kind of the value. And I mean, it sucks. It makes for a very boring brand of baseball, but this is kind of where we're at. The episode ends with the Hall of Fame and the very first class. And it's pretty remarkable just to see how old some of those guys are as we've been following their journey. So that's really interesting. And yeah, I mean, again, just the idea that 1939 is the 100th anniversary of baseball. Probably not factually accurate, but again, a lot of myth making in this episode.
I mean, you kind of have to when there's a lack of records, but I thought it was kind of cool. It's kind of that, I guess the first initial Hall of Fame class for the WWE when it was 95, 96, something like that, and they had that dinner. It makes me think of that, but in this case, they had it in front of the crowd at Yankee Stadium, which was really cool. And I liked how the players dressed up again and posed. That was some really cool stuff, man. Because if you were in that building or in the stadium that day, that's got to be the highlight of your baseball life. Going to that, you know what I'm saying? To see all those legends and stars for the first Hall of Fame. So that was really cool. I really liked that, and it was cool to see Babe Ruth. At the end of it's past his career at this point, but still him just in that pose. That was really cool. And I guess this is the episode where they revealed that Babe Ruth really wanted to be a manager and never got the shot. And I mentioned before, some of these players that don't become superstars but have long careers can end up as these great coaches based on their experience. So I don't know if they just didn't feel like Babe Ruth was the kind of guy that can bring the best out of his players or whatnot, but that would have been a really interesting post-career move for Babe Ruth. But I don't know if he had the patience for it, but because he seems more of
I
like an
think it's
individualistic player.
genuinely insane that somebody who wanted to be a manager like Babe Ruth, and I guess the Braves did this to an extent, but why wouldn't you bring him in just for the publicity alone? Especially if you're the one of these also ran teams. Like, what in the hell do you have to lose? So yeah, it's really stupid. Just the execution of that is very poor. But something that we did not mention, we did talk about Branch Rickey kind of reinventing baseball, bringing in the concept of the minor leagues as well as spring training. And this is important because the sixth inning really is Branch Rickey's kind of moment to shine as he brings Jackie Robinson into Major League Baseball. That really is the focal point of of episode six. Episode six kind of starts by going over the 1941 season, one of the most important seasons in the history of baseball, and basically regarded as kind of this last summer of innocence, because of course 1942, 3, 4, and 5 would very much be marred by the real life events of World War II. But you have Joe DiMaggio and his 56 game hitting streak, and you have, and this is still true to this day, the last player to hit 400 in professional baseball, Major League Baseball, that being Ted Williams. So you have this great contrast of what's happening in the summer and then what happens during the war, and then the slow rising of the Brooklyn Dodgers, only for them to introduce Jackie Robinson as the first player to play Major League Baseball. And we can talk about some of the other things as well, but Jackie Robinson really is the focal point as we're kind of transitioning away from Babe Ruth and really getting into his story.
Yeah, really quick though, you want to do Ted Williams first? Because I feel like he was the first part of this episode, and
I mean, very
I don't know.
much so. It's weird, like it's weird how they focus so much of Ted Williams on 1941. Then they kind of talk about him at the end of his career, but they don't really talk about like the middle. Like it's really it's kind of strange just the way that the Ted Williams is addressed, because I mean clearly one of, if not the best left-handed hitter in the history of professional baseball, and I mean kind of a Bret Hart type, but I think he's a little bit too, like he's a little bit more cantankerous than Bret Hart. I know Bret Hart gets accused of kind of being that, but I think Ted Williams is very much of that ilk because like technically he was one of the best hitters of all time.
I got a Sting vibe from him just because how cool he is, and I mean that in the most sincere way because growing up, I was obsessed with that 2004 Boston Red Sox team, and when Ted Williams came out, I was like, this old man is like so cool, and like the smile on his face, it's like every baseball player wanted to be around him when he came out of the field. And then because of the timing of this, he was able to give this amazing coherent interview and perspective on his career for this documentary, and I was just blown away by his like cadence and the way he presents himself and his like the way he chooses his words, his diction. Like it seems like he's a very well spoken dude, and it's like he's a really cool guy. And the fact that he stuck with the Boston Red Sox through all that, and that he didn't like get sold or get traded to the Yankees, is like, to me it's like that Sting thing. He was there till the end kind of thing. Like Sting was with WCW. Despite all the ups and downs, and despite losing in the World Series and having a bad World Series that haunts him that haunted him till like the day he died, probably. He talks about it, having a bad World Series and batting 200, and how that affected his team, and how like he just didn't want to go. Like basically they created a shift in the infield because he was just hitting in the right field all the time apparently, and he just didn't care that they were doing the shift, and he didn't even think about hitting opposite field, in which that's just ego. And he kind of admits it in the interview where he's like, I batted 200 and I could have done better. And they talk about how the shift happened in games, 6 and 7 or something, and it completely changed the momentum of the games. And then he hit 200 overall. And it was like, wow, that sounds like almost like a Stargate 97 kind of like, oh, such disappointment. You're there. You could have had it, but you had this shitty kind of ending to it. So I kind of see the Sting Ted Williams connection, but yeah, 400 I think is never going to be done again. Like, I think the highest I've ever seen in like my lifetime is like 340, and that was like what Manny Ramirez. Um, yeah, it's gonna be tough because
Yeah, it sucks.
it's gotta be like on point. You gotta be 3 for 4 maybe every other game, and then the worst you can do in a week is like 1 for 4. You know what I'm saying? Like never having an over 4 game is gonna be impossible.
Yeah,
I think.
it's really difficult, especially with the way pitchers are and the specialization of the game. That is definitely something to be concerned about. But like I said, Jackie Robinson really is the focal point, and I think he deserves to be arguably one of the most important baseball players of all time. And they really dig into the racism that he faced and the process of him being signed by Branch Rickey, going to Montreal, the opening day, April 15th, 1947, a day that is still celebrated, I would say, somewhat cynically by Major League Baseball to this day, and becoming such a popular player. And like everybody kind of sharing their reflections, including some of the various talking heads and Arthur Ashe before his passing. Like it's crazy to me that Arthur Ashe was interviewed and he passed away in 1993 and he was still a part of this documentary. It's pretty wild to me that happened. And, George Will comes out and basically says that besides Martin Luther King, Jackie Robinson is likely one of the most important players if in history and not one of the most important civil rights figures in history.
Yeah, I would say Rachel Robinson really like shined in this episode for me. Like she just has like this clear and coherent memory of that era, and then everything just kind of like seems so clear when she's speaking, and the way everything kind of breaks down. It seems like 42, the movie that we reviewed over a year ago, kind of got it right, more so than we thought, maybe in terms of like the 3-year rule they put on him, like do not fight back, do not respond to any of these people for at least 3 years. That way you kind of ease yourself and get some friends before you start mouthing off back. And then the hug on the field and the all the racial shit that all the opposite players were yelling at him throughout the whole game, which they obviously had in 42 as well. So I don't know, maybe 42 is better than we thought it was when we initially reviewed it. That's kind of my feeling that I'm getting. Like maybe they got more right than I thought. And then just Rachel Robinson was like a shining like light in this whole documentary. Like she's so well spoken in this. It just makes the picture clear in your mind. You know what I'm saying? Like I think she did such a good job. And yeah, I think that's true. Like Jackie Robinson is probably the second most important figure in terms of like racial and equality next to Martin Luther King, because I mean it just changed the perspective of things, right? And then once one domino falls, another domino will fall, and that leads to the 1960s pretty much, or the 50s and 60s pretty much, with finally black players able to play. And they talk about how Jackie Robinson literally changed like base running. Like he literally, like the idea of stealing a base wasn't that big of like a technique or an ability in baseball before Jackie Robinson like took advantage of it. And they talk about how even just a base on ball, he could steal the second, get a pop fly, get down to third, and then either steal home or wait for another pop fly and basically get a fucking run, a single run manufactured without having a hit, which essentially is what small ball is. And it's kind of interesting now that as of this recording, we just saw the Detroit Tigers beat the Houston Astros in probably the most incredible 2-game small ball example that we've seen in recent memory. Like they won the first game 3-1, and the next game was like 5-2, and the Tigers had hardly any hitting. It was ridiculous, and it's all about their incredible starting pitching and the relief pitching.
And their
So
bullpen. The Detroit Tigers are going to be really interesting to watch just because they feel like the very antithesis of so many of these other teams. And I mean, again, if you get hot, that's what it feels like. Those are the teams that feels like that win these days. Is it's not about having the best record. It's just about getting hot at the right time, and perhaps the Tigers have done so. We kind of get the end of Babe Ruth's story as he passes away in 1948, very prematurely. And I have to say, listening to Babe Ruth and his gravelly voice haunts me, man. It is, I talk about some dark stuff in the 30s, but hearing his voice as on his day and seeing him like super thin and gaunt in his uniform, I mean, it's just, I mean, never will you see the idea of facing one's own mortality than seeing Babe Ruth at the end of his life.
Yeah, I kind of get that same feeling when I see Brian Hildebrand. Do you know who I'm talking about? That referee from WCW that died in the 90s,
Yeah,
late 90s?
I mean, certainly, especially with what
Like, there's
cancer
this
can
one
do.
picture that I've seen of him that just breaks my heart because it looks like he's so, like, on the brink. And I feel so bad for the guy because he was such a ball of energy in the ring. So I hate when I see those those images, man. It really, like, ugh, it's like a gut punch. So that gravelly voice you're talking about really does haunt me too. But I kind of got over it because I realized, that's just life. And one day we're all going to go through that kind of transition. So to see Babe Ruth, oh, it was just heartbreaking because it's kind of like that Andre thing, just larger than life character, dies early, overindulged, overindulged with women as well. But yeah, just that larger than life feel, and it's just gone. But um, it's just kind of weird that the day or he died 48 and Jackie Robinson debuted in 47, so it's just this weird transition of like one icon to another kind of thing. So yeah, that's kind of the way I kind of see it, as like this passing of the torch, so to speak, unbeknownst to Babe Ruth. Obviously, it's just kind of the timing of everything. But yeah, it's just really unfortunate. But Jackie Robinson, man, like I said, made a difference in terms of base running, and they had that run in the first 2 years he got there. No, the first year he got there, they went to the World Series. And I like how Vince Scully talked about Ebbets Field, and for some reason, it just reminds me of PWG and the Reseda Legion Hall, and how we went from there to this bigger venue across the way, but it just doesn't have that same magic and feel as Ebbets Field, right?
I mean, yeah, it's just it sucks that, and we're going to talk about this actually in episode 7. What happens to the Brooklyn Dodgers and kind of the tragedy of that entire circumstance. But I think this I think is the strongest set of episodes that we're going to talk about, just because I think you're seeing so many different transition points and finally introducing black players into the game. There isn't as much labor conversation, but that is going to be a huge focal point of the next 3 episodes. We will definitely be having a chance to talk about labor issues, the greatness of Marvin Miller, and how important he is to professional baseball. Plus, gambling coming back to rear its ugly head with Pete Rose. So there is that to look forward to. But I think it's really great that we have one episode that is so heavily focused on Babe Ruth. We have another episode kind of so heavily focused on the Negro Leagues, and you have this episode 6 that is just kind of bringing it all together and kind of paying those things off with, Jackie Robinson entering the game as Babe Ruth is unfortunately exiting. And I think again the storytelling is as good as the first 3 episodes, if not better, and just the way they pay things off. And I mean, really, when you get Buck O'Neill telling the story the way he does, that literally is the only way that you can end that episode. Even though it happened in the 40s, but they covered it in the 30s episode, I totally get why they did it that way. It would not have really made sense to be in the 1940s episode, I don't think.
Yeah, I think the way Ken Burns put this together in terms of structure, it fits the narrative well. Rearranging, you could rearrange it a little bit, but I think the way he put it together, it's just the themes and the stories connect, and that's kind of what you want in terms of like a documentary. You don't want to have these random points where like certain narratives stop, and then you create a whole new narrative part of the documentary about this whole other storyline. It's better when it just kind of flows and connects together. So I think the editing's, as I mentioned in last week's episode, the editing on this documentary, or 9 documentaries, whatever you want to call them, are just incredible. And technically, like, again, I'm still watching these VHS versions, but it just seems so
You're still on that, huh?
hey, it flows, man. That VHS hum, but I could just tell the way that Ken Burns put this together in the early '90s is such that old school way of doing documentaries that it's kind of a lost art, I think, in terms of just taking a camera, zooming in on an old photo, zooming from the top to bottom to make it look like it's moving, and then having this amazing voiceover with the music and just setting the tone.
I mean,
Nowadays, it
this
just
is
seems like it's interview
it's
heavy.
5 years. This what they literally did this from 1989 to 1994.
Yeah, they took their time, and I think modern documentaries are just different in terms of like the more investigative reporting type documentaries nowadays instead of like a true
Well, I
history.
think documentaries have much more of an agenda, and there's an access play with so many of these as well. Like you're doing a sports documentary about a specific athlete, and that athlete kind of has skin in the game. I even think about something like The Last Dance, where Michael Jordan, whether people want to admit it or not, clearly had an influence on that documentary, and it affected both the perception and the narrative that was being told. And I mean, look, again, I think that this Ken Burns' baseball can very much be focused around New York a lot, but I think that they're still able to kind of cover a lot of different topics. And maybe next week we can get into like what we wanted to see more of. But I think focusing on the Negro Leagues as much as they do alone makes this worthwhile.
Yeah, I would say like the one criticism I'd have for these couple episodes is just they didn't kind of mention this amazing run that the Yankees went on. They mentioned that DiMaggio and all that and Gehrig retiring because of ALS, but they forget to mention that at the end of the decade they went four straight, yeah, which is incredible. And then they do another five straight like 10 years later. So maybe they'll mention the next episode.
We're
But I thought
gonna.
that was a
I
really
mean, the
odd thing they didn't cover.
1950s is literally basically covering like the Yankees, the Dodgers, the Giants. That is the majority of the episode. So you can you'll definitely get a lot more of it because again, the 1950s, you have the Yankees winning 5 World Championships in a row. You have the Big Willie Mays catch. You have the Dodgers and Jackie Robinson finally winning the World Series, and then both the Dodgers and the Giants going to the West Coast. So that is what we have to look forward to in that episode.
You'll get more of that Dodgers perspective from my end because yeah, I've been to Dodger Stadium in obviously different decades, and I've seen the changes at the stadium, and it's quite the park. I'll tell you that. And it's we'll talk about it next week, but the parking structure is insane.
All right. Any other thoughts?
I would definitely like if you were only to watch one episode, I would say episode 6 because that really
That's the
covers
one. I would
historical
agree with you.
records and like historically Jackie Robinson and the end of Babe Ruth and all that. Because I vaguely recall probably watching some of these clips in like high school for like history class. For some reason, I distinctly remember that gas story. Did they do that in 42 where he takes the pump out of the bus? Was that in
Yeah,
40?
I mean, the thing is, Brian, you have to understand that Ken Burns, like 20 years later, he did an entire 2-part series on Jackie Robinson.
Okay, that I didn't even know. So the dude loves Jackie
I
Robinson for
think it
sure.
might be. I mean, next year, I don't know when the Jackie Robinson, but we might need to do the 15th anniversary of the baseball extra innings. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty wild. And I mean, the Jackie Robinson, like I know that you might be thinking like, oh, what else could they cover? There is so much in that documentary that is worth covering by itself.
Well, it sounds like a possible plan for next April because April 15th, wink, wink. Jackie Robinson Day.
2016 is when it came out. Which, yeah, 2016, April of 2016.
Oh, okay, seems about right to cover. We'll talk about it in a future episode.
Yeah, I mean it's 2 parts and it's like 2.5 hour episodes. So
Sounds about Ken Burns.
yep. All right. So for Brian, I'm Jerome. We will talk to you again next week. We will finish our discussion, our conversation on Ken Burns' baseball, the 1994 episodes. Talk to you next week.